This is TLV1.
The Tel Aviv Review.
Hello and welcome to the Tel Aviv Review, a program dedicated to the word, to the thought and to debate. I'm your host, Gilad Halpern, and every week I'll be engaging in close encounters of the intellectual kind with writers, scholars, researchers, and all people who have done something to make our lives a tad more interesting. I am now joined here by Jeffrey Herf. He's a distinguished history professor at the University of Maryland in the United States. He is currently in Tel Aviv to give a talk about the attitude of East Germany and the West German radical left towards Israel between the Six-Day War in 1967 and the fall of the Berlin Wall in 1989. Hello, Jeffrey, and welcome to the Tel Aviv Review.
Good morning. It's a pleasure to be here.
Of course, we need to go back to a very different geopolitical context when we're talking about this specific topic, namely the Cold War. And imagine Germany as divided by the Iron Curtain into two hostile political entities. Now, before we get to their attitude towards Israel, which is the crux of our conversation, and even though they shared the same Marxist-Leninist worldview, can we really lump together East Germany and the West German radical left?
Yes and no. The no comes first. One of the important arguments of the forthcoming book, At War with Israel, is that East Germany was far more important than the West German radical left for influencing events in the Middle East. So the actual impact was just the reverse of the amount of journalistic attention it received. Mm-hmm. The West German terrorist organizations, the Red Army faction, and
is that Baader
Meinhof, and the successor groups, the revolutionary cells that carried out the Entebbe hijacking, they received an enormous amount of understandable journalistic coverage in the Western press. But the East German government was not a political movement or an organization. It was a state. It had an army, it had a diplomatic corps, it had an intelligence service, it had embassies. It had a very small arms industry, and it had state-to-state relations with Syria, Iraq, Libya, the other frontline states.
But weren't they in the orbit of the Soviet Union? Weren't all the decisions made in the Kremlin?
The decisions, the overall framework of Soviet bloc policy was, of course, established in the Kremlin. But each of the Warsaw Pact states had a choice to determine how enthusiastic they were going to be. And one might think that because of the Nazi past, the East Germans might be a bit reticent. But just the reverse was the case. East Germany was the most enthusiastic of the Warsaw Pact states, insofar as participating in the anti-Israeli campaigns.
What does that mean exactly? How did their activity differ from that of other East European countries?
In 1973, the East German government became the first state in the Warsaw Pact that opened an office of the Palestine Liberation Organization. That was a year before the Soviet Union did so. I believe that China had a PLO office in 1965. But the Chinese at that point were impoverished and weren't producing a great deal that anybody in the world wanted to buy. The Soviet Union was far and away the primary arms supplier of the Arab states. So the East Germany was, of course, small, 17 million people. The Central Intelligence Agency in its declassified reports estimated that it gave about 3% of the weapons that the PLO and the Arab states received from the Warsaw Pact. Mm-hmm. But it was also very important for the political warfare or diplomacy that it carried out in support of the Arab states and against Israel at the United Nations and elsewhere.
Why was East Germany so preoccupied with the Israeli-Palestinian conflict, or with Israel in general, more than other countries, leaving the Nazi past of the country aside?
Well, the East Germans were communists, and like other communists, after the anti-cosmopolitan purges in the early 50s, they associated Israel with American imperialism. And so that was something that East Germany had in common with the rest of the Warsaw Pact. But there was another element, which was the effort by the East German government to achieve diplomatic recognition. The West German government, in order to try to undermine East Germany, had declared something called the Hallstein Doctrine, which stated that West Germany would refuse to have diplomatic relations with any country that had diplomatic relations with East Germany. So the problem for the East Germans was, how do we establish diplomatic relations with anyone outside the Warsaw Pact? And in 1969, the East Germans achieved their greatest diplomatic victory since the state was founded by establishing diplomatic relations with Iraq, Egypt, Syria, Yemen, and the Arab states. And the path to diplomatic recognition, the key that opened the door, was East Germany's hostility to Israel.
Right. And to what extent did it influence anti-Israel policies throughout the Eastern Bloc?
That's a good question. I can't answer it adequately. The hostility to Israel was Soviet policy. It was, I'm not suggesting for a moment that East Germany was driving policy in the Warsaw Pact. That would certainly be a mistake. That was not the case. But in view, one could say that Jeffrey Herf has an unwritten 11th commandment of German history after Hitler. And the unwritten 11th commandment, which has never been written, and is don't kill more Jews, and don't help anybody else to kill more Jews. Whether you put Nazi war criminals on trial, or if you pay financial restitution, or you return the artwork, or you're nice to the synagogues, and that's all very well and good, and of course a civilized country should do that. But the absolute minimum is don't kill any more Jews.
Yeah. Well, East Germany famously disavowed any connection to
East
to
Germany.
Nazi
Said all the Nazis are over in West Germany, and we got rid of them because we got rid of capitalism, and capitalism produced Nazism. This was in fact there was much more continuity. There were many former Nazis who worked in East German media and not in the top ranks of the party. But the East Germans, in fact, sent weapons to the Arab states. They had an alliance with the Arab states, Syria above all, but also military training and considerable education, 3-4-year fellowships for many, many young people from the Third World in general and from the Arab world in particular.
Did it meet with any opposition within the East German intelligentsia? I mean, opposition is something, of course, that was almost completely absent in the political culture there, but were there any other voices saying this is wrong?
In 1949, the Soviet bloc as a whole experienced something called the anti-cosmopolitan purges. There were communists in the Soviet bloc who wanted to have close relations with Israel because they associated Israel with anti-fascism and with the Second World War, and the communists and the Jews had both been attacked by the Nazis. And in the course of the anti-cosmopolitan purges from 1949 to 1956, these people were arrested, purged, some were driven, some fled, some were imprisoned. All of them lost political power. So as of 1952-53, with the Slansky trial in Prague and the Paul Merker case in Berlin, the Doctors' Plot in Moscow, the pro-Israeli sentiment in the Soviet bloc was crushed. And to be a member of the Communist Party or in the government after 1949 and 1952-53, really, it was impossible to be sympathetic to Israel. Now, were there people in East Germany who thought this was a mistake? Yes, but they had no political influence. On the contrary, there were some sort of non-Jewish Jews, such as Albert Norden, who ran some of the propaganda campaigns in East Germany, who offered a Jewish face to anti-Zionism, and that was very important in the Soviet bloc.
Right, of course.
But the opposition was, by the early 50s, it was crushed. Yeah.
Why was 1967 the cutoff point in your current study? What was before and what was new?
Well, the alliances were emerging, but there were diplomatic relations between East Germany, the Soviet bloc, and Israel. But in 1967, the Soviet bloc as a whole cut off all diplomatic relations. East Germany never established diplomatic relations. But with the war, the hostility to Israel, which had been a part of East German policy, became known to an international public as a result of a speech that the leader of the country, Walter Ulbricht, gave in Leipzig on June 15th, 1967. And for people who had not been following...
So that was before the Six-Day War?
No, the Six-Day War was June 6 to 12.
In June, you said?
June,
oh,
yes,
sorry,
yes.
I thought you said January.
Right. It was the week after the war ended. And the week after the war ended, and Ulbricht gave this speech in Leipzig in which he not only supported the Arab states, but accused Israel of starting an unnecessary war, that the war was caused by the United States, that the Israelis were behaving like Nazi Germany, that Israel had faced no threat whatsoever in the weeks before the war. The speech was a shock to an international public opinion that had not been following East German events closely. So, and it was followed by more arms shipments to Egypt and Syria, and more conversations back and forth, and then in 1969, the diplomatic breakthrough.
You said arms shipments. Could they offer anything more than just lip service? Because at the end of the day, they were subordinate to the greater Soviet empire, which was also the industrial and military powerhouse of the bloc.
You're right. Yes, absolutely. The big weapons, the MiG jets, the T-34 and T-54 Soviet model tanks, the heavy artillery, in those years came from the Soviet Union, the factories in the Soviet defense complex. But the East Germans produced Kalashnikov assault rifles, millions of bullets, things like binoculars and uniforms, and also hospitalization for the wounded. So in every way they could, they expressed what they called anti-imperialist solidarity with the PLO in those early years.
Right. Now let's move to West Germany and the radical left there.
Yeah.
You said in the beginning of this conversation that, of course, they got a lot of press in the West, but how significant was their impact?
The terrorist organizations were the extreme expression of a more widespread hostility in the West German left. And in that sense, they were significant for intimidating the Jewish community in West Germany. When you travel to West Germany, you'll notice policemen standing in front of synagogues. They're there for a reason. The PLO wanted to open up what it called a front in Western Europe and in West Germany. And in opening up the front, it sought allies in the West German radical left.
Why the West German radical left and not in other places in Western Europe? What was so special about the West German radical left? Well,
the West German government was very generous with fellowships. So Arab students received fellowships to study at West German universities. The General Union of Palestinian Students, GUPS, had about 26 chapters around the country, about 800 members, something like that, just before the attack on the Munich Olympics in 1972. So that was significant. The West German, there was a strange sort of psychological contortion. What does coming to terms with the Nazi past means? It means to fight fascism. Who are today's fascists? The Israelis are today's fascists.
Sounds familiar.
Yes. Yeah. Today's fascists are Israelis. So in order to fight Nazism, we have to help these people kill the Jews. I mean, it was a kind of a lunatic dialectic, but it was expressed by Ulrike Meinhof in one of the most important texts, in my view, of European anti-Semitism since 1945. I don't think it's translated into English. She wrote an essay after the Munich attack on the what was called the action of Black September, in which she described the attack on the Israeli athletes as both anti-imperialist, anti-fascist, and anti-Zionist, and a great revolutionary deed. So there was a scandal, I mean, for many West German liberals, and they recoiled from what she said. She also attacked Willy Brandt and called Moshe Dayan, compared Moshe Dayan to Himmler.
Was it around the time that they started taking the Red Army faction seriously, or did it take some more time until they...
The Red Army faction was taken very seriously by then, and by 1972, the leaders were in prison. Mm-hmm. And they had engaged in a number of bank robberies. And the West German police caught what was called the first generation quite quickly. Mm-hmm. Then the subsequent famous hijackings in Entebbe and Mogadishu were efforts to get them out of prison.
Mm-hmm. And talking about the political rhetoric, the West German radical left, did they echo the same kind of things that we heard in East Germany and the Soviet Union, or because of the different political context in which they were operating, it took a different form?
The rhetoric was, on the whole, quite similar. The West German left was not being directed from the Soviet bloc. That, as far as I can tell, that's not the case. It had it was an indigenous, part of the Western New Left. One thing that was different about the West German left than the East German government was that the West German left lived in a democracy whose government was officially devoted. It had an official tradition of Vergangenheitsbewältigung, of coming to terms with the Nazi past, of opposing Nazism and opposing anti-Semitism. One can say this was lip service, or, I happen to think that it was genuinely believed by the West German leadership. Mm-hmm. But at any rate, the general culture of the country was to be aware of anti-Semitism and to be aware that attacking Israel brought with it tones of anti-Semitism. So the West German left had to respond to criticisms that they were anti-Semites in a way that the East German government never had to bother with that issue.
And how did they deal with it?
Several ways.
Of course, they didn't see themselves as anti-Semites.
They didn't understand anti-Semitism, but of course they said, no, we're not anti-Semites. There were a number of ingenious responses. One was that the accusation of anti-Semitism was itself a clever tactic on the part of the Zionists in order to deflect criticism. And it was an imperialist tactic, a propaganda effort, and it confused criticism of Israel with anti-Semitism. Another was that anti-Zionism was a form of opposing anti-Semitism because the Arabs are Semites. So if you're really opposed to anti-Semitism, you should want to destroy Israel. And what was needed was to overcome, in the words of Dieter Kunzelmann, a West Berlin leftist, the Jewish complex, all this terrible guilt that supposedly was on the shoulders of this next generation. And once you got over this Jewish complex, then you saw that the PLO for the Germans was what the Vietnamese communists were for the American left. And for the West German left, for these people, the Middle East was more important than the war in Vietnam. Because with the Middle East, there was then, and the support for the Palestinians, there was a kind of liberation from the burdens of German history. The Palestinians are the last victims of Nazi Germany, and now we're going to help these victims of Nazism against their Zionist oppressors.
Right. Okay, Professor Jeffrey Herf, I'm afraid this is all we have time for, so thank you very much for this. You're a distinguished professor of history at the University of Maryland in the United States, and your forthcoming book is about the attitude of East Germany and the West German radical left towards Israel. Thank you so much.
Thank you very much for having me.
And this brings us to the end of our show. Thank you very much for listening, and also big thanks to our technician Adam Scher. I'm Gilad Halpern, signing off in Tel Aviv. Do join us again next week for another edition of the Tel Aviv Review, and until then, goodbye.